Hello, I have two crime writers with me today, and together we are going to solve the mystery of what makes a good read. My first guest is Colin Dexter, creator of the famous Inspector Morse, the laconic Thames Valley detective played on television by John Thaw and watched avidly by 750 million viewers in 50 countries. Morse first appeared in Dexter's novel in the 1970s and was retired last year in the most final fashion. Dexter is on record as saying he was glad to see him go. Dexter himself is often described as sharing several of Morse's characteristics, an appreciation of whiskey and Wagner, and an interest in literature among them. He's also said he would rather be remembered as a good schoolteacher than a best-selling novelist. He began working life as a teacher in Leicester and only started writing fiction on a rainy family holiday in Wales when he read a couple of detective books and realised he could probably do a bit better. My second guest has also worked outside the literary field. Russell James has been a manager for IBM and a business consultant. He's now the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Painting in the Dark, about a couple of crooks attempting to con an 85-year-old woman out of her famous works of art and getting a great deal more than they bargained for. It's been described as a work of art in its own right with a breathtaking twist at the end. Russell, we're going to start with your choice of book, which is actually a work of non-fiction, but pretty breathtaking nonetheless, I think. Tell us about it.
Well, I did think it was the coward's way out to choose a piece of non-fiction. This is a book of journalism by Martha Gelhorn called The View from the Ground. And interestingly, it's a collection of the writings that she's put out in the 20th century, arranged by decade. So you have pieces from the 30s right through to the 1980s. And Gelhorn really covered everything. She went everywhere. She covered the Spanish Civil War. She covered Europe in the Second World War. And more homely things like the Committee of Un-American Activities with McCarthy. She went to Israel in the 50s and 60s. She covered the Eichmann trial. She was in Africa, Vietnam. And she took several long, hard looks at her native land, America. I've always liked Martha Gelhorn's writing, both fiction and non-fiction. She's one of those writers who, not only as many journalists do, sympathise with the downtrodden. If there's a war on, she's not there with those dropping the bombs. She's on the ground where the bombs are landing. But she is capable in a single paragraph of giving you the full essence of what it really felt like to be there. And if ever you wanted to find journalism at its absolute finest, I think you need do no more than read the very first piece in this book, which is called Justice at Night, written about an incident that actually happened to her in 1931, when she and a friend who had hired a car for $28.50, which unsurprisingly broke down in the middle of nowhere, and she was given a lift by a man in a pickup truck. Only when they were inside the truck did she realise that he was on his way to lynch what he called some goddamn nigger who had supposedly raped a widow, who was a woman approaching 50, who in his own words was known to be cruel hard on niggers. And what really makes this story stick out more than any other was not only the obvious thing of condemning the sort of people who would do something like this, but it placed you, the reader, with a question. If you were rescued with a broken down car in the middle of absolutely nowhere in the year 1931, and this man turned out to be your driver, what would you do?
Yes, I agree. That's a stunning essay, and she and her companion are actually forced to watch the lynching, and all her companion can do is weep. And we all love to think that we would have intervened, whilst knowing that the reality is that most of us would have been terrified of being lynched ourselves. It's a stunning essay. Colin, what did you make of this collection?
Well, an awful lot of things, really. I was very impressed right at the end when she said that all her reporting life she'd been throwing us a few small pebbles into this very large pond and so on. She hoped a few ripples would get to the... I think that's very true. But for me, I find it awfully difficult to read a book over about 250 pages. And I must say, I did get in various parts of the book a little stuck. I thought that the chapter on the refugee camps in Palestine was very repetitive, and I wanted that to end as quickly as possible. I think I also felt, when you get a book like this, I've never met the good lady before, but, it says it's deep with humanity, does it, on the cover, and beautifully written. Certainly she's on the side of the angels, isn't she, all the time? But I didn't feel myself it was beautifully written. I certainly think she is succinct, but Only some of the things stuck out to me as extraordinarily memorable. If I were the chairman of a beer panel, which I know I'm not, the big test above all is whether you'd go back and order the same glass of beer at the bar. And I wouldn't want to read another book by Martha next week, although I did feel that some of these pieces were extraordinarily moving.
I'm delighted to disagree with you, actually, about the one on the refugee camps, which I thought was one of the best pieces in the book.
It's very interesting, that, isn't it? Because she visited the Palestinian refugee camps. I think it's in the 50s or the 60s, that one.
It's in the 60s, and of course she didn't stop there. Most writers, I think, would have visited the camp and told you what they saw. And she, famously on the side of the downtrodden, would have been expected to sympathise totally with what the Palestinian refugees told her. And to a degree she did while she was there, but she also did what a journalist should do. She followed up. She went back to the town that they claimed to have come from, the town where there were beautiful olive groves and farms, and one of them lived virtually in a palace, to find that when she actually got there, the farms and olive groves had never existed because it was on the side of a mountain.
I found that fascinating, that essay, precisely because of the time when it was written. And this is a woman who lived through the Second World War, observed much of the Second World War, and she is clearly very much on the side of the Israelis and is very anti-Palestinian. And I would be fascinated to know, were she still alive, if she were able to go back now, would her opinion have shifted? There's an extraordinary scene where a Palestinian refugee is talking about some of the incursions that the Israelis have made. And she's quite dismissive of this and says, what does this man know of war? And you suddenly realise just what this woman has seen in her life, that she does actually feel quite justified of saying of a Palestinian refugee, something that none of us would dare to say as privileged Western Europeans. She does feel completely justified in saying this man doesn't know what war is, and and because of that, you realise the desolation that she has witnessed in Europe with the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War.
Because she came out of Europe with the refugees. She walked with them when they were coming with all their family possessions.
I didn't say I felt this boring. I said I felt it repetitive. Do you feel yourself, though, that she was a bit naive, a bit jejune about some things? I mean, not all these people who are downtrodden really deserve 100% of our sympathy. And I felt that when she was talking about protesters, and maybe we've all known a little bit about protesters, they all seem so goody-goody. I was particularly upset by the Greenham Common women when they said the only really nasty thing was when the Thames Valley Police came along.
Yes, the worrying thing is always, did you know anything about it? I mean, she wrote a beautiful piece, in fact, beautiful appears in the title, The Beautiful Day of Dissent, in the 1970s, about the student protests in America, which to a British reader reads fantastically. But what you're saying, Colin, I suppose does come true both with the Greenham Common.
I thought that was the worst piece in the book about these wretched women in Washington. I really did. Not a girl has got anything, not even a handbag slung over her shoulder, and then one of them feeds a baby and changes the nappy, and you wonder where all these things are. In my school days, we had to keep them in their knicker pockets or something, but most of these girls seem to be without any underwear whatsoever, and I felt it was wholly jejune.
I think whether or not that's an objection.
No, it's what she says.
But it certainly took me back to the 70s and the days of student protests.
I actually enjoyed that aspect in that I enjoyed her freshness. I mean, I agree that with our relatively jaded eyes, sometimes she does seem a little naive, but I really liked her honesty in that so many male journalists, I feel, are very anxious to prove how intellectual and objective they are the whole time. And although she's very good at quoting statistics and backing up her arguments, she never pretends to objectivity unless she genuinely feels it. I mean, she just expresses outrage in places where I think a more cautious journalist would try not to. I mean, of the Eichmann trial, she's furious that some people say, oh, what's the point in trying this man? Yes. And she says, I think this so shocking, I cannot find words for my indignation. Yeah. And I really admired her honesty on that level.
I think so. The reason I admire her as a 20th century journalist, and I'm in the camp that places her as one of the best, is I think nobody writes more passionately, more clearly, more irrefutably than Gelhorn.
What upsets me about her is she's a loaded, she's a weighted writer. She's biased in favour all the time. When the police come along, they're always helmeted, poor souls, you know, and they're all heavy booted. I've never seen a policeman in slippers anyway. And what does she expect? She talks about nuclear weapons, and my goodness me, I was on protest as well against them. But she says, you know, these unnecessary, useless things. And I think that you lack the perspective if you take that point of view, talking about the nuclear deterrent. And I did not feel, with her writing, that type of balance.
Well, a slightly mixed review there from Martha Gelhorn. I certainly loved her humanity and certainly I'm right with her on her objections to objectivity. That was The View from the Ground, Martha Gelhorn's essays. We'll move on to your choice now, Colin, and it's a completely different genre altogether.
Yes, I've chosen More Poems. That is the third collection of Housman's poems after A Shropshire Lad and Lost Poems. This More Poems was not published until after Housman's death in 1936. And Housman himself did not wish these poems to be published in his lifetime, and he left his brother Lawrence the job of sorting out a few. In fact, here there are 48 only in More Poems. And why I thought it would be very interesting to talk about this for a little while is that the quality of these poems, in my view, and many other people who love Housman's work, are really extraordinarily beautiful. And I thought that if we all read those, it might very well take us on to read the whole corpus, the whole of the collected poems. I just wondered what you felt about More Poems yourselves.
Well, I was very glad to read these because I certainly think they're a great improvement on A Shropshire Lad, which I wasn't too keen on, and I agree with you that More Poems are the best of A.E. Housman's work. Russell, what did you make of this?
Well, I struggled with a slight disadvantage that because I'm the author that Ian Rankin once famously dubbed the godfather of British noir, it won't surprise you to learn that I hardly ever read poetry at all. And I picked up this book of Housman's poems, and indeed I read the entire book because I had not read the man before. I picked it up with a certain degree of trepidation, but was fairly relieved to find that even the introduction to the Penguin collection, John Sparrow said that Housman's poems appeal not only to the fastidious critics, but to people who do not in the ordinary way care much for poetry. And as Housman once wrote in the margin of a book, "This is me." So I did actually read The Shropshire Lad first before coming on to concentrate, as you had asked, Colin, on the section entitled More Poems. I found it reasonably difficult, to be honest, to separate the two out. I thought this was all part of a continual stream. The book I was reading, which was, as far as I could see, all the poems that Housman ever did write, in effect, the output of one man's life became a kind of autobiography of the man, in which More Poems fitted very neatly between the main work at the beginning and the few after poems that came at the end of the book. I very much enjoyed it, to my surprise.
It is interesting, isn't it, that these were the poems which he didn't publish in his own lifetime, and what we all seem to be saying is that actually these are the best of his work.
No, I wouldn't have said they were the best. What I think is that amongst these 48 poems there are half a dozen which seem to me quite supremely wonderful poems, even by Housman's standard. And clearly some of More Poems were omitted, some of them because they were religious poems, and Housman was a devout atheist, a high church atheist, I think he said. Some of them clearly are incomplete. Some of them, again, are unfinished because he didn't want to reveal personal emotions, all these sort of things. And yet, if I may just quote one or two, it does seem to me that the translation from Horace, for example, I to my perils will cheat and charm her, how clear, how lovely bright, from which I took the title of the last Morse novel, Crossing Alone the Nighted Ferry. And above all, I think on Four Lands High in Heaven, I would rate these poems very high, even among the very best from his other collections.
I mean, the reason I liked More Poems much more than the earlier collections, I suppose, is that what I like least about Housman is the kind of the pastoral stuff, the shepherd lad striding across the hills and all the rest of it. I don't enjoy those much, and they seem quite sort of sub-Wordsworth and sub-Coleridge. And I think Housman is at his best when he's writing about loss and loneliness and personal bitterness. I mean, the short poem that begins More Poems, I think is wonderful, and I can quote it in its entirety. They say my verse is sad, no wonder. Its narrow measure spans tears of eternity and sorrow, not mine, but man's. This is for all ill-treated fellows, unborn and unbegot, for them to read when they're in trouble, and I am not. And I think Housman is absolutely at his best when he's doing that. And it's interesting that these are the ones that he suppressed during his lifetime. And I have to say that the works for which he is more well known, A Shropshire Lad, Blue Remembered Hills and so on, interested me a lot less than these posthumous works.
Now, I could see why the first book was the one that made the impact. I came to this as one who thought himself a Housman virgin. I actually discovered inevitably that, of course, I recognised and knew some of these poems, even those that were not ones that had supplied titles for Inspector Morse books, or indeed the novels of Andrew Taylor or anybody else. That first book, I suspect you have tired of because you know them so well. But I actually found A Shropshire Lad was an incredibly strong set of poems for a non-poetic reader like me. I then came on to read with interest the book that you like. But for me, to be honest, Colin, it didn't add anything greatly other than a kind of academic footnote to what had already been there in A Shropshire Lad.
Yes. I think that the criticism, which is was absolutely futile against Housman, a great pessimist, of course, he called himself a plagiarist, but when he said throughout, didn't he, that out of a stem that scored the hand, at a nettle I wrung it in a weary land. And his wonderful 14 words, almost all of them monosyllables, and I will friend you if I may. This is from A Shropshire Lad, in the dark and cloudy day. And I was introduced to him at 17 at school, and he's never let me down on that. He's been a great joy to me, in spite of this really rather embittered life that he lived. I'm
interested, as you're clearly a great Housman fan, have been for a long time, whether or not you would make a case for him for being more well known. I mean, the comparison that came to my mind was Auden. I mean, Auden was apparently a great fan of Housman, and I would say that Auden is a great poet in the way that I think he transcends the time in which he was writing, he transcends gender and sexuality. And Housman, although I did enjoy a lot of this collection, I would still say that I consider him a minor poet. I did feel that he was very much of his time. I wonder, would you make a case for him being up there with Auden?
No. I mean, I don't know quite what minor poems mean, and I don't know what the comparison is with other poets at all. All I would say is that he told everybody exactly what he was going to do, and in the spirit of the Greek anthology. I mean, I think when you talk about him being better known, he's wonderfully appreciated by at least all my friends. And hope he will be by you too henceforth.
I'll certainly appreciate him now that you've introduced
well.
me to him. And I'm very glad that, because the only way I could read this book in paperback was to read the complete works, that it gave me a chance to read what is in effect the Victorian collection first, because that's what A Shropshire Lad is. And then when one went on to more poems, by and large, this was a 20th century collection, early 20th century, Edwardian, if you like. And the contrast between that Edwardian mood and the Victorian mood was one that I was introduced to for the first time, and I found very rewarding.
That's certainly true. There's definitely a progression. Now, that's more poems by A.E. Housman. We'll move on to my choice now, which is a novel, unusually the only novel in the programme this time round. It's a contemporary book written by the contemporary writer Jill Dawson. It's called Fred and Edie. It's her third novel, recently published. It was shortlisted for the Whitbread Novel of the Year last year, and it was recently shortlisted for the Orange Prize. And it's based on a true story. It's based on a murder story which happened in the 1920s, and it was the story of a woman, Edith Thompson, and her young lover, Freddie Bywaters. Bywaters murdered Edith Thompson's husband, and the prosecution case centred around the allegation that the two had cooked up the murder together in order to free Edie Thompson from this horrendous marriage so that she and her lover could run off together. Edith Thompson herself, I think, has become a sort of Ruth Ellis figure. There's a great debate about whether or not she was really guilty. It was, after all, her lover who committed the murder and not her. And the novel is structured partly around newspaper reports of the time, some of the real-life letters that Edith Thompson wrote to her lover, Freddie, when they were in prison awaiting trial, and a large number of invented letters. And what I liked so much about this book, that I really felt that Jill Dawson had got inside the mind of Edith Thompson. She has a very distinctive language of her own. She's a kind of upper working class, lower middle class woman who's bright enough to know that there's more to life than a dull marriage with a dull and sometimes brutal husband. But the mores of the times means that she has no obvious escape route, and she's almost like a kind of Emma Bovary. It's almost inevitable that she's going to fall madly in love with somebody very unsuitable and ruin her own life. I don't think that she tries to whitewash Edith Thompson at all. She doesn't try and pretend that she's an angel or completely innocent. She shows her own culpability, occasionally her greed and her vanity. And the most touching thing for me is that we know that the book is going to have a bad ending because it's based on a real-life case, and that's open knowledge what happened to Edith Thompson. And Edie herself in the book doesn't realise this, and her gradual realisation throughout the book that the court case is going to go badly for her is very, very touching, I think. Colin, what did you make of this book?
It's always enormously difficult, isn't it, this faction business where you make up a bit and then, you take bits from the newspapers. What I felt immediately on page 1 or chapter 1 was when it says a large crowd gathered around hoping they might see the couple. I'd have loved to see a picture of these two. I've not got it. I had a look through the shelves, but I've not got. I'd love to see what they look like because they're an extraordinary pair, aren't they? And there are many things I enjoyed about the book, but I think it's hugely difficult to say, this is authentic. Here's the Daily Mail and the Daily Sketch, and that's it, and here's a date and everything. And on the other hand, these letters, she says, are based on the letters, but it seems to me extraordinarily doubtful that she'd base very much on the actual letters at all. She mentions, I think, at the end, 3 pages, and I don't know, if you add them up, probably about 28 lines or so. And so she's in betwixt and between, really, when she's trying. And I didn't myself get a very clear picture, I don't think, of this poor girl. In fact, as the book went on, which I felt was extremely readable, but as it went on, I found myself sympathising with the other 2 poor people. I found this fellow Percy, he seemed to have had a dreadful time. He wasn't the greatest lover in the world, was he?
We might have a gender divide here. I think Percy deserved everything he got. Russell, what did you make of this book?
Well, Jill Dawson does stress at the end that this is a work of fiction. And it clearly is, because the Edie presented in this book, very well presented. I mean, a claustrophobic portrait of the First Order. But this Edith is based mainly on the kind of naive, adventurous, bold but foolish, wistful and romantic Edith that you could pick up from the love letters, and there were rather a lot of these love letters produced at the actual trial, which was a trial that in its day, in the 20s, did divide public opinion. But one has to say that it doesn't quite stack up with the real-life Edith as one would assume she must be. She was, after all, the older woman. There was no evidence.
Only 28.
Well, she was only 28, but Bywaters, who actually used the knife, he was only 20 or 21. Yeah. And when
he was a bit of a toy boy.
Well, yes, one is tempted to say she must have seduced him. I mean, he was, 20 when the affair started? Conceivably, in those days, he was the virgin. She certainly wasn't. She was the married woman. And that is not the Edith that's presented in the book, who is so naive and so not of this world that she doesn't even realise when she's in prison the risk that she's in.
The trouble with this book is that this dear woman, Jill Dawson, writes far too well. She's a beautiful writer.
I think she's concealed a little from you. One has to remember that
Jill Dawson... I bet you Edith didn't write like this, because
I think she probably did,
because she lost to literature.
Jill Dawson edited a book of these very letters, and I think the reason she hasn't regurgitated them all in here is because she's been there, done that. So in this book, she gives you, as you say, 3 letters, I think, in the whole thing.
3 pages.
And only at the end does she tell you which pages they were. And I have to say that they didn't stand out to me at the time, which is a credit.
It's absolutely seamless, the real-life letters and the invented ones. And the thing I liked so much about this book is that I think what Jill Dawson manages to do incredibly well is she gives a sense of the time, the 1920s. And quite often when people write about a woman prejudiced against or in a condemned situation in the past, they give it a modern gloss in a way that's not convincing. And I was absolutely convinced that it was the 1920s. But at the same time, there's a real sense that society is in flux, and society is about to change in a very major way, and the position of women is about to change. And even though Edie, yes, she is naive in some ways, she doesn't know what's coming, but she knows that what's happening to her is not right. She can't articulate how, but there's a scene where she has to visit the prison doctor because she's unable to sleep. And she says, "The doctor says I have been a vain and silly woman. You seem, Mrs. Thompson, not to have accepted the reality of your husband's death and the predicament you find yourself in. I wonder, when he says such things, how could I demonstrate that I have accepted the reality and the predicament I find myself in? Would he be satisfied with more emotion from me or less? That is, if I fainted and took to wailing more often, would he be convinced of my innocence and that I am a loving bereaved wife, or would he find me over-emotional, even more vain and silly? Does he really require more composure? Would that persuade him of the authenticity of my distress?" And she is absolutely trapped, because she's supposed to be on one hand the grieving widow, but on the other hand, when she does express emotion, that counts against her very heavily in the trial.
But the trouble is, she's trying to steer this enormously difficult path, between fact, which she reproduces in all these newspapers, and fiction, and imagination, and sympathy, and all the rest of it. Yeah, it does disturb me a little bit when she says at the end, the chaplain, his name wasn't that at all, and he was nowhere near the sort of fellow who came along and so on. I feel, in a way, that you are half and half, betwixt and between. And she obviously had a very, very real difficulty in explaining. I mean, after Edith Thompson was hanged, there were the two things that were the great public outcries. One of them was whether she was pregnant or not, wasn't it? And the other was whether she had, been giving the poor old boy a powdered glass on his porridge every time. And neither of these things, which seem to be absolutely vital in a crime story, were resolved at all.
Oh, they aren't. I mean, as well as ones that Colin mentions, we also get no mention in this book that her defence mounted an appallingly inept case for her, or that the judge's summing up was, by all accounts, cruelly biased. And even the press, the real-life press, there's not a word of this in the book, the real-life press at the time complained bitterly that the judge had basically unfairly directed the jury to the verdict too.
The two wonderful things about this for me, I think, is that I would like to read Jill Dawson rather than Jill Dawson pretending to be Edith Thompson, because I think she writes wonderfully well.
She does write very well, and I think actually we have to take this not as a faction, but as a character study. It's a claustrophobic character study.
Yeah, but we don't hear much of the others, do we? We don't know anything about poor old Freddie at all. He was probably horrible.
It is a first-person novel, so I'm not sure whether that's a reasonable complaint. But I certainly can endorse the fact that Jill Dawson is a wonderful writer, and that the first two books are very good as well. That's all we have time for this week. We've been discussing Fred and Edie by Jill Dawson, published by Sceptre at $6.99. More Poems by A.E. Housman, and you'll have to buy the collected poems to read that. That's published by Penguin Poetry at $5.99. And The View from the Ground, essays by Martha Gelhorn, published by Granta at $8.99. Thank you to both of my guests, Russell James and Colin Dexter. Until next week, goodbye.